The stove glowed hot in the center of the barracks, hissing and popping with dry wood. Outside, the Texas wind bit through canvas and bone. Inside, the bunkhouse was warm, too warm. But the Japanese women, 30 of them, stood outside in thin coats, refusing to step in. The cowboys cursed under their breath. "Suit themselves," one muttered, tightening his belt. "Don't want comfort? Fine." A week later, the doctor made his rounds. Frostbite on 3 women, bronchitis on 5. One girl's toes had blackened. That night, the physician stood in the snow, staring at the frost-etched porch rail. "They're not being defiant," he whispered. "They're terrified." He'd found the answer in her lungs. Scars. Smoke scars. Hiroshima. Heated rooms didn't feel like safety to them. They felt like fire. And now, the men who had mocked them for shivering outside faced the bitter truth. These women weren't rejecting warmth. They were reliving the heat of hell. The trucks rolled in just before dusk, the kind of dusk that turns the Texas sky into rust and steel. Wind coiled low over the plains, dragging cold through the brittle grass and against the wooden watchtowers that creaked as if they too were shivering. The POWs came down from the flatbeds one by one, 30 women, thin as broomsticks, wrapped in threadbare coats that did little against the December chill. Their breath fogged in front of them as they stepped onto the frostbitten dirt. Eyes lowered, feet dragging, faces unreadable. Cowboys turned camp guards leaned on their rifles, arms crossed, watching like they expected saboteurs but got schoolgirls instead. The guards were told they'd be overseeing enemy assets, trained auxiliaries from the Imperial Japanese forces. But what they saw were shadows of women, nurses, clerks, teenage volunteers barely keeping upright. Some had no gloves. One had socks wrapped around her ears. A few tried to huddle close together, only to be snapped into line by an American sergeant's bark. "Let 'em find their own footing," one cowboy muttered, flicking a toothpick across the dust. "They're not made of glass." The barracks had been cleaned for their arrival. They were simple wooden structures, long and rectangular, built fast but sturdy. Inside, Army-issued stoves burned with cut cedar and mesquite, their warmth slowly pushing back the cold from the corners. Wool blankets were folded at the foot of every bunk. A pot of stew simmered in the mess hall. It wasn't much, but it was more than any of these women had likely seen since the war began. But when the guards gestured them inside, the women hesitated. One stepped forward, only to stop in the doorway, blinking at the red-orange glow of the stove inside. She backed away. Another clutched her coat tighter and stood like stone. Eventually, the women walked in, but they avoided the center of the room, where the heat was strongest. Some stood near the windows, some pressed against the far wall. When night fell and the guards made rounds, they found several of the women lying on the floorboards far from the stove, curled in corners, stiff with cold. At first, it was just peculiar. By the second night, it was infuriating. "They won't get near the heat," one guard complained, pouring coffee from a tin pot, steam swirling in the lamplight. "Think we're cooking them alive in there or something?" "They're freezing," another replied. "We're giving 'em what we got, and they spit on it." A cowboy named Roy, tall with a limp from an old rodeo injury, shook his head. "Let 'em freeze if they want to," he grunted. "Ain't our job to tuck 'em in. If they want to play snow statues, that's their problem." But it wasn't just the cold that made the situation strange, it was the silence. The women never complained, never asked for more blankets, never spoke to the guards unless spoken to. They followed orders, lined up, took their rations, but when dismissed, they returned to their corners, their backs to the stove. One guard tried to move a cot closer to the heater for a girl who had a cough. She quietly dragged it back while he was gone. Some guards laughed about it in the mess hall. "Maybe they worship ice," one joked. "Or maybe they just don't like American heat." Others began to wonder. A corporal asked the translator if something in their culture forbade heat. The translator shrugged. "No," she said slowly. "Not heat. Maybe memory." But most of the cowboys chalked it up to pride. "They're stubborn," Roy said, spitting into the frost. "Still think they're soldiers. Still think it's war." And so, night after night, the stoves crackled with warmth, and night after night, the women stayed close to the shadows, their thin coats barely stirring in the heatless corners, as the cowboys watched from the porch, wondering why anyone would choose the cold. The first one to fall was a girl named Hannah, though no one knew her name at the time. She collapsed during morning roll call, her body folding into the frost like a marionette with its strings cut. The guard shouted, startled, and the others barely flinched. They'd seen worse. But the medic on duty, Lieutenant Carlton Baird, dropped to one knee beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, then lifting her wrist. Pulse, faint, breath, shallow. Her skin, when he brushed back her hair, was pale and slick with cold sweat. "She needs heat," one guard said. "Bring her inside." "She won't go," another replied. "She's one of the ones who sleeps by the wall." That afternoon, Baird examined her inside the camp infirmary, a drafty outbuilding with peeling paint and cabinets that still smelled of iodine. He placed a stethoscope to her chest, expecting congestion. What he heard was worse, crackling, not wet but dry, like wind through brittle paper. He ordered an X-ray. The machine whined, and the image slid out minutes later, grainy and gray. He stared at it for a long time. It wasn't pneumonia. The patterns didn't match. There was no fluid buildup, no viral inflammation. Instead, he saw linear scarring deep in the lower lobes, old and permanent. Smoke damage. He blinked, checked the name again, then called for another scan. This time, a second girl. Same result. A third. Again. That evening, Baird sat alone in the infirmary office. A file open in front of him, the stove hissing quietly in the corner. Outside, the wind gnawed at the windows. On his desk lay 3 X-rays. 3 lungs, 3 women, all with scarring too deep to have come from anything recent. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, not because he needed one, but because it gave him something to do. When the nurse knocked on the door with a clipboard, he barely looked up. "These girls," he said softly. "They're not sick. They're burned. On the inside." The nurse frowned. "From what?" He tapped the edge of the film with one knuckle. "Inhalation. Smoke. Maybe chemicals. But it's old. A year. Maybe more." The nurse didn't ask the next question, because they both knew what it would be. There was only one place in Japan where lungs could be scarred like that, where fire didn't just burn buildings, it burned the sky. Hannah woke later that night, coughing weakly into a rag. When Baird offered her water, she took it without meeting his eyes. She sat stiffly on the cot, eyes fixed on the stove in the corner. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She just pulled the blanket tighter and stared at the flame like it was a warning. Over the next week, more women were brought in for inspection. None of them complained. But their lungs told stories their mouths would not. Scars, adhesions, bronchial narrowing. Not one of them said the word Hiroshima. Not one of them had to. Baird began to understand something the cowboys didn't. This wasn't about stubbornness. It wasn't about discipline or pride. The heat reminded them of something, not warmth, but death. He tried to explain it to one of the guards. Roy, the tall one, with the limp. You think they're just being difficult, Baird said, holding up one of the films. But look at this. These scars didn't happen here. This isn't frostbite. This is fire from another world. Roy squinted at the image, unimpressed. So what do you want us to do? Let 'em freeze? Baird exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward like memory. No. But maybe stop blaming them for being afraid of something we can't see. That night, he watched from the infirmary window as the women filed back into the barracks, stepping carefully around the stove, as if it might explode. Some stood all night near the door, blankets clutched tight, unwilling to sleep too close to the flame. Baird didn't speak. He just closed the curtain, sat down, and marked the files with a single word, under diagnosis: survivor. She was 19 when the sky burned. Her name was Emiko, though in camp she barely spoke it aloud, and few ever asked. To the guards, she was just another silent girl in a line of silent girls, thin, alert, obedient. But Baird remembered her because she never sat. Not near the stove, not on the benches, not even during meals. While others folded themselves against the walls, Emiko stood by the window, hands at her sides, always watching. Still as stone, always watching. But before the barracks, before the shivering silence, there had been a different kind of fire. It had started as a morning like any other in Hiroshima. She had walked to the school hospital where she worked as a nursing assistant, her hair pulled back in a ribbon, her satchel holding little more than a pencil, a rice ball, and a cloth-wrapped first aid kit. The sky was blue that day. No planes, no sirens, just the hum of cicadas and the occasional cart on the stone road. She was in the linen room when the bomb fell. The light came first, blinding, white-hot, unreal. It didn't explode so much as erase. The windows shattered inward, glass turning to dust mid-air. A breath later, the building lurched, cracked, and began to fall. Emiko was thrown beneath a collapsed beam, the ceiling pancaking down in waves of smoke, blood, and timber. Fire swept through the corridors like it had a destination. She could hear people screaming, but only at first. The sound didn't last long. She crawled out by instinct, not hope. One eye was swollen shut, her right hand burned raw. The floor beneath her was too hot to touch, and the air blistered her throat. She passed a girl younger than her, face down in the courtyard, hair smoldering. Beyond that, there were no bodies, only shapes of bodies, bleached into walls by the flash. Her shoes melted. Her lips cracked. Somewhere, a bicycle wheel spun uselessly in the rubble. She didn't remember walking, only that eventually, hours or maybe days later, she woke in a shelter outside the city. Her skin had cooled, but her blood still whispered heat. Years passed in weeks. The empire surrendered, uniforms were burned, officers vanished. And then the Americans came not with rifles, but with clipboards. Her name was written down, misspelled. She was placed on a boat, then a train, then a truck, until one winter morning she stood on the frost-bitten soil of Texas, staring at a stove she could not go near. What the Cowboys didn't understand was that Emiko's fear had nothing to do with defiance. It was memory. Every fire crackle sounded like the beam falling above her head. Every breath of smoke dragged her back into burning corridors. The warmth in the barracks wasn't warmth, it was threat, betrayal, a cruel echo of the heat that had taken everything and spared her only to carry the memory. She said nothing. She never told the guards or the other women. Even the doctor who looked into her lungs and saw the scars didn't know the story. There were no words in English or Japanese that could make sense of what it meant to walk out of a city erased from the map. So she didn't sit. Because sitting meant relaxing, letting go. And she knew better. In camp, her posture was mistaken for pride. And each night, when the barracks filled with warmth and blankets and slow-breathing silence, Emiko stood with her back to the stove and her face to the window, watching a sky that had once caught fire and never truly gone out. She wasn't alone. All across the camp, other women mirrored her silence, her stillness, her distance from the stove. It was unspoken, but understood. Some clutched their blankets while standing. Some slept upright, backs against the wall, eyes half open. The guards thought it odd. Baird noted it in his journal. But for the women themselves, it was as natural as flinching from a wound that never healed, because to them, warmth no longer meant comfort. The fire that crackled inside the metal stove didn't sound like safety. It sounded like the roar of collapse. The smell of mesquite smoke, which reminded the Americans of winter cabins and campfire beans, reminded the women of burning skin and melting roofs. Even the color of the flame was familiar, the wrong kind of familiar. It was the same orange that flooded their vision just before the world split open. They didn't talk about it outright. Trauma had a way of binding the mouth, but it lived in their posture, in the way they moved through the barracks like ghosts in their own bodies. One girl refused to unroll her blanket until morning. Another asked, in broken English, if the firewood was treated with chemicals. No one laughed, not even the translator. Some of them came from Hiroshima, others from Nagasaki. A few from cities spared the bomb, but not the flames, places where incendiaries turned wood and paper homes into fire traps. And though each woman had her own story, what tied them together now was the shape of heat in memory, unbearable, everywhere, and without mercy. So they avoided it, not defiantly, but instinctively. It was a herd behavior, born from a single burned memory carried by many minds. Like birds that fly before a storm, they moved away from the stove without thinking. It was not protest. It was survival. But to the Cowboys men who had grown up with wood stoves and hard winters and the notion that fire meant life, it all looked like foolishness or arrogance. Roy, standing with his arms crossed one night, watched the girls crowd along the far wall and shook his head. They got a fire, a bed, a hot meal, and they act like we're torturing them. They're just not used to it. Another muttered. Roy spat. They better get used to it. This ain't some kind of spa. He wasn't cruel, just tired. Like many of the men, he'd lost a brother in the Pacific. Some had lost sons. Watching the women turn their backs on warmth stirred something bitter in their blood. It looked like ingratitude, like a refusal to heal. Baird tried to explain. It's not the heat that bothers them, he said one afternoon while bandaging a frostbitten toe. It's the memory that comes with it. Every flame, every crackle that's not a stove to them. It's a siren they can't stop hearing. Roy didn't respond. He lit a cigarette with a match and stared at the thin thread of fire. I get that, he finally said. But it's just a damn stove. Baird didn't argue. Because the thing about trauma is it doesn't care about logic. It doesn't care what's just a stove. When you've survived the impossible, even kindness can feel like threat. Back in the barracks, one of the girls sat by the door, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the floor. But she didn't look up. The fire popped behind him, and she flinched, not visibly, but deep in the body, like a muscle remembering pain. He stood there for a second longer, then set the cup on the floor beside her and walked out, the door creaking closed behind him. She didn't touch it. Not yet. The warmth was too close. Dr. Baird stared at the frost edging the infirmary window, tapping a pencil against the metal rim of an ashtray overflowing with half-smoked cigarettes. He hadn't slept well in days. The X-rays sat on his desk, scattered like silent testimonies, lungs etched with trauma, bones thinned from years of malnutrition, bodies that had endured more than anyone in this camp could fathom. And outside, the Cowboys still grumbled, still said the girls were playing games, still muttered about stubbornness and pride. He snapped the pencil in half. Minutes later, he was at the officers' quarters, boots tracking snow into the entryway, breath clouding in the cold. Captain Harris looked up from a steaming mug, eyes narrowed. "We got a problem?" the captain asked. Baird didn't sit. "You think these girls are spoiled," he said, voice low. "You think they're ungrateful, but you're wrong." Harris raised a brow. "Doctor, we give them food, shelter, heat. If they want to shiver in corners, that's on them." "No," Baird snapped. "It's not." He pulled a file from under his coat and tossed it onto the table. The top page showed an X-ray with scarring deep in the chest cavity, faint but unmistakable. Another followed. Then a third. "These girls aren't refusing heat. They're afraid of it. Because that heat, fire, smoke, the way it smells, it's not comfort to them. It's memory. Their bodies remember something their mouths won't say." Harris looked at the images, jaw clenched. "What am I looking at?" "Lung scarring. Not from this winter. Not from colds or frostbite. This is chemical and thermal damage. It's what you'd find in survivors of a firestorm. Or a bombing." Baird's voice softened, but only just. "You think they're being dramatic? I've got 5 girls who flinch at the sound of wood crackling, one who won't go near the stove. And you know what? She's not even the worst of it." The captain frowned. "Are you saying—" "Yes," Baird cut in. "I'm saying some of them are from Hiroshima." That word dropped like a stone. Captain Harris leaned back in his chair, lips tight. Behind him, the stove hummed, faint and steady. He reached to turn it down, as if instinctively. "I didn't know," he said finally. "They don't talk about it," Baird muttered. "They're not like us. Pain, to them, is supposed to be quiet. But I see it in their skin, their lungs, the way they sleep if they sleep at all." Harris looked at the file again, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "They never said a word." "They wouldn't," Baird said. "You think I got this out of them over tea? I had to piece it together, the coughing, the X-rays, the burns they don't complain about." He paused, the anger in his face softening just enough to let weariness through. "They're not defiant. They're haunted." Outside, a guard called roll. A whistle echoed across the yard. Harris rubbed his forehead like trying to erase something he couldn't understand. "So what do we do?" he asked. Baird sighed. "Stop treating it like discipline. Don't force them near the fire. Give them distance. Let them thaw on their own terms." The captain nodded slowly. "We thought they were just being difficult." "No," Baird said, turning for the door. "They're surviving!" As he stepped back into the cold, the wind knifed through his coat, sharp and clean. But after what he'd seen, what he now understood, he welcomed it. Cold could be cruel, but fire, for these girls, had once been the end of the world. And in that quiet reckoning, something shifted. Not policy, not procedure, but understanding. And in a camp ringed by barbed wire and frost, that was the beginning of change. The next morning, a new stove arrived. Smaller, rounder, with a longer chimney pipe that vented directly through the barracks roof. The guards installed it themselves, moving quietly, almost reverently, as if the metal thing were a peace offering instead of a heating unit. They placed it far from the bunks and close to the door, where smoke could escape more quickly and warmth would reach more gently. It was a gesture not just of practicality, but of listening. But the women still didn't come closer. They remained gathered by the windows, their thin blankets pulled tight, their eyes scanning the snow-covered yard beyond the glass. Even when steam rose from their breath and their hands trembled as they clutched tin cups, they refused to turn toward the center. Even when one cowboy slipped in extra blankets, folded like gifts at the foot of the straw mats, the women barely acknowledged them. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even fear anymore. It was mourning. Private Langley, the youngest of the guards, tried to make sense of it. He'd grown up in the Oklahoma Panhandle where winters could cut straight to the bone, but even in the leanest years, his mother made sure the stove never went out. Heat had always meant home, but here he watched the women shrink from it like it might betray them. So he tried something different. He and two others placed heated bricks wrapped in cloth and soaked in hot water along the walls where the women huddled. They said nothing, just left them there. The women stared for a moment, then reached cautiously, brushing their fingers against the warmth before pulling away again. One woman, older than the others, finally picked hers up, cradled it in her hands. But even then, she turned her back to the stove. Captain Harris noticed. He said nothing to the guards, but he nodded once. Later that night, as wind moaned through the pine fencing, the barracks remained dim, the fire reduced to a few soft embers. Smoke curled gently through the vent. There was no crackling, no flame, just the whisper of breath and winter. And in that hush, a voice, fragile, barely audible, broke through the silence. Fire doesn't warm us. It came from a young woman near the far wall. Her name was Una. She had spoken little since her arrival. Most assumed she didn't know English. But now she spoke clearly, her voice thin but resolute. It took everyone. The room held its breath. No one asked her to explain. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The weight of those 4 words settled over the room like ash. Fire doesn't warm us. It took everyone. And with it came a shift. Not loud, not immediate, but felt, bone deep. One woman quietly stood and walked to Una's side, placing her hand on her shoulder. Another, younger, pulled her blanket tighter and turned toward the window again. The guards said nothing. A few stood just beyond the doorway, listening through the wooden walls. For the first time, they understood that it wasn't the stove. It wasn't even the memory of heat. It was what that heat had stolen. Mothers, fathers, brothers in uniform, sisters carrying children. Cities reduced to dust. The fire had not merely burned, it had erased. And now, even the suggestion of warmth felt like a betrayal to what had been lost. Inside that barracks, no one moved for a long while. The stove crackled faintly in its corner, but no one looked at it. All eyes were on the girl who had spoken, and in the quiet, something unspoken passed between them all, a recognition. Grief, shared, is still grief, but it's not silence anymore. The fire was inside, and it would take more than warmth to let it burn out. The coats arrived in the back of an old Ford pickup, covered in flour sacks and the scent of hay. They weren't government-issued. They hadn't come from any military supply depot. These coats came from someone's home, woolen, hand-stitched, lined with care and softened by age. The tags were worn, the pockets deep, and the stitching uneven in places. But the thread was strong. It was the rancher's wife, Mrs. Donnelly, who had sent them. No one had asked her to. She'd simply shown up one morning at the gate, cheeks pink from the wind, with a bundle in her arms and a look in her eyes that dared anyone to say no. "I heard they were cold," she said. "Well, I can't stop the war, but I can sew." The guards took the bundle into the barracks like it was contraband. Not out of suspicion, but out of reverence. They hadn't expected this. Neither had the women. The coats were distributed slowly, one at a time, folded with care like offerings at an altar. Most of the women accepted them with hesitant bows, not meeting the guards' eyes. A few looked confused, unsure if they were being mocked. But when they touched the cloth thick, soft, warm, they held it close. When Emiko was handed hers, she hesitated. It was gray, with black buttons and a faded lining. A small rip on the left sleeve had been patched in careful stitches, just like the ones her mother used to sew into her school uniform. She didn't want to take it, but refusing would be worse. So she bowed slightly, took the coat in her arms, and stepped aside. She slipped her arms into the sleeves, pulled it around her shoulders, and then everything stopped. A sharp, invisible wave hit her, not sound, not light, but scent. Cedar. The coat smelled like cedar wood. Not firewood, not smoke, but that specific, sharp, sweet scent that used to fill the storage closets of the school hospital in Hiroshima. It was the scent of the supply room, where gauze and linens were folded in neat piles, the scent of the hallways, just after they waxed the floors, the scent that had risen from burning timbers, charred beyond recognition, when she had crawled over bodies in that ruin of a building. Cedar. Burned. Cedar. She dropped to her knees. There was no scream, no collapse of drama, just a slow, shuddering fall like something inside her had buckled. Her fingers clenched the coat. Her face was turned down, hidden. But the tremble in her shoulders gave it away. Then came the sound. Not a cry. Not at first. Just air leaving the body in broken pieces. Then a sob, hoarse, involuntary, and another. She buried her face in the wool and wept like the war had just ended and begun all at once. The room froze. The other women looked at her, wide-eyed. Some took a step back. Others stood in place, clutching their own coats tighter. They'd seen Emiko quiet, angry, even feverish, but never undone. Not like this. It was Yuna who moved first, the same girl who had spoken about the fire. She knelt beside Emiko without a word. Then another woman followed, and another. They didn't speak. They just placed their hands on her back, her shoulder, her hand. Because they understood now it wasn't just fire, or heat, or pain. It was scent, memory, the past carried not in words but in senses too strong to suppress. One coat, one breath, and everything came loose. And the guards, still standing at the door, didn't dare interrupt. Not because they were afraid, but because, for the first time, they saw that grief was not a storm that raged. It was a stillness that shattered. That day, the women realized something they hadn't said aloud. They weren't alone. The cold came early that evening. Not the brittle, bitter kind that bites the fingertips, but a softer chill. The kind that wraps around your shoulders like the memory of something you've survived before. Most of the women were already indoors. Their coats hung carefully, their bodies curled on cots or near the drafty seams of the walls. Silence lingered in the barracks like a breath held too long. Outside, a cowboy crouched near a pile of split cedar and struck a match. He was younger than most, with straw-colored hair tucked under a worn hat and hands that moved without urgency. He wasn't on duty, wasn't there on orders. Just him and a small pile of wood he'd collected by hand. He cleared a circle on the frost-bitten dirt just beyond the perimeter, where the fence rose like a reminder. Then, slow and steady, he lit the fire. It crackled to life, not in anger, but in rhythm, controlled, quiet. The flames swayed, their light flickering through the fence posts and across the barracks walls. A guard farther down the line glanced over, puzzled, then turned away. The cowboy sat cross-legged beside the fire and reached into his coat pocket. A harmonica. The metal gleamed faintly in the firelight, dulled by time and use. He turned it in his hand once, then lifted it to his lips. The sound that came wasn't sharp or showy, just a slow, wandering melody, not one meant to impress but to remember. A tune with no name, stitched together from lullabies and lonesome trails. It didn't fill the camp. It didn't try to. It simply drifted, like smoke, through the wire. One by one, the women noticed. Yuna was the first to peer through the slatted window. Then Haruko, then two others. Quietly, they slipped outside, standing just behind the wire. Not close, not obvious, just there, watching. The firelight danced on their faces in broken rhythm, interrupted by the chain link. It made their expressions harder to read, but the stillness said enough. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, from somewhere near the back, a sound, barely audible, a hum, a single voice, breathy and unsure, rising with the melody. It wasn't Japanese, not exactly, just tone matching the notes, not the language. Yuna's lips didn't even part at first. She hummed, like someone exhaling a secret, and slowly the air shifted. More women emerged, coats wrapped tight, drawn not by heat but something gentler. Memory, maybe, curiosity, or the miracle of sound that didn't demand anything in return. The cowboy didn't look up, didn't speak. He just played. For the first time since their arrival, warmth came without smoke, without fear. No flames roaring through rooftops, no ash sticking to the back of the throat. Just a small, open fire that asked nothing, offered no harm, only presence. It was the first night none of the women flinched at the scent of burning cedar. No one crossed the fence. That line held, but something passed through it anyway, something quieter than speech and deeper than gesture. A kind of permission, a reminder that not all fires burn, and not all silence means nothing. The melody wound down like the last page of a letter. The cowboy set the harmonica down in his lap and leaned back, watching the flames curl inward. None of the women clapped. But they didn't leave right away either. They stood a little longer. Then, one by one, returned to the barracks, their steps slower, lighter. Behind them, the fire burned low, and the cold didn't feel quite as cruel. If you're finding this story powerful, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The cold that week came down harder than the last. The kind of frost that crept under door seams and curled in through the cracks in the barracks floorboards. Even the cots felt stiff, as if the wood inside them had frozen too. The wind outside didn't howl, it whispered, a slow, brittle wind, like someone drawing breath but never speaking. That night, something shifted. No announcement, no sudden courage, just a quiet decision made beneath the surface of things. Emiko unrolled her bedding, not at the farthest edge of the barracks like usual, not in the darkest corner, but halfway down the middle row. The stove was still a few feet away. But for the first time, she did not turn her back to it. She didn't reach for it. She didn't touch the iron belly, where warmth glowed behind a thin grate. But she didn't flinch either. The other women noticed. A few glanced up as she moved. No one said anything. One girl paused while brushing her hair, her hand stilled mid-stroke. Another lowered her eyes and resumed folding a blanket. But it was felt. A weight in the air, not tension, but witness. The wool coat, now familiar, rested over Emiko's shoulders. The same one from the rancher's wife. Its faint scent of cedar had faded to something neutral now, a smell of fabric and sleep and dust. It no longer pulled her backwards into memory. Tonight, it simply covered her. She lay down on her side, knees pulled gently toward her chest, hands tucked beneath the coat's edge. Her eyes remained open a while, watching the low flicker of the stove's light dance across the beams in the ceiling. The fire didn't scream. It didn't crack or rage. Just a low, steady breathing. Outside, a cowboy on the night shift paced the perimeter. Every few passes, he slowed at the edge of the barracks and looked in through the window slats. Nothing ever moved much at this hour. But that night, something did. He paused longer than usual, gaze settling on the faint shape of Emiko's figure, closest to the stove. He didn't speak, didn't call attention, just watched. In the morning, he was still the one walking rounds when the sun broke the edge of the hills. He entered the barracks quietly, boots brushing against the frozen dirt floor. The stove had burned low through the night. Just embers now, but it had done its job. And there she was, Emiko, curled beneath the coat, breathing slow and steady. Her cheeks flushed faint pink from warmth instead of fever, her hair tucked behind her ear. She hadn't stirred at his steps. The cowboy stood for a moment, just long enough to see, to know. He didn't wake her, didn't say a word. He only walked over to the stove, crouched down, opened the iron grate, and fed in 2 more pieces of wood. The fire didn't leap, didn't roar, just brightened softly, as if it had been waiting. Then he straightened, tipped his hat slightly toward the cot, and left. There was no ceremony, no orders, no applause. But when the rest of the camp awoke, they saw it too. Emiko near the stove, the coat unmoved, the fire kept lit. And, for the first time, no one asked questions, no one assumed. They simply accepted it. Sometimes, healing isn't loud. It doesn't break open with revelation. It just begins to happen, one silent inch at a time. By March, the hard frost had lifted. Ice no longer clung to the corners of windows or lined the inside of boots. The doors to the women's barracks were kept open now, letting in the breeze, the dust, and something else they hadn't dared invite in before: light. And with the light came sound. Not much, not often, but enough. A cough followed by a chuckle, a rustle of blankets, and a low murmur of conversation. Once, a cowboy swore he heard a song not full-throated, not even sung aloud, but hummed, breathy and broken, as a woman folded laundry near the fence line. The coats still hung on pegs beside the bunks, but now some of the girls wore them. Not all the time, not when the stove was burning high, but on cool mornings, or when walking between mess hall and latrines, a few wrapped themselves in wool and didn't flinch. There was no single moment of change, no speech, no orders. The transformation came like sunrise, gradual, unnoticed, until everything was touched by it. What had once been a camp of quiet defiance had become something else. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but a shared breath, an understanding without translation. Inside the barracks, Emiko sat cross-legged on her cot with a folded sheet of paper in her lap. Her writing was slow, deliberate, a pencil in her right hand, the coat tucked neatly behind her. She wasn't wearing it today, but it was there, always near. The letter was for her older sister, though she wasn't sure if it would ever reach Japan. She had written 3 before and never received a reply. Still, she wrote, "Sister, I am safe," she began. "The guards here are strange. Some are loud. One plays music through his nose." She paused, the pencil hovering, and then wrote, "I remember the hospital, the air thick with ash, the sounds that were not sounds, but the ends of them. I never told anyone before. I did not know how. We were not taught to speak of pain. But in this land, even the fire can be gentle." She folded the paper. No envelope, no stamp, but she held it against her chest for a long time, as if its weight mattered more than its destination. Outside, 2 guards leaned against the mess hall wall, sipping coffee. One nudged the other, nodding toward the open barracks door. "She's wearing the coat again," he said. The other shrugged. "Looks good on her." Neither spoke of the past winter. Neither brought up the stove. At lunch, the women lined up as usual, but one of the older ones, a seamstress who'd barely spoken a word in 3 months, said "thank you" in English when handed her tray. Her accent was thick, her voice hoarse, but the guard heard it. The men didn't laugh anymore. They didn't smirk at the girls gathered by the windows or joke about how even fire can't melt stubbornness. That season had passed. Later that afternoon, as the sun stretched long over the fences, Emiko sat outside, sketching in the dirt with a stick. Not letters this time, just shapes, curves, waves, maybe memories. Behind her, the stove inside glowed soft orange, unthreatening, alive. And maybe that's how it ends, not with apologies or parades, but with silence that no longer hurts, with warmth that no longer threatens, with people who once feared fire now basking in its gentler form. They were never cold. They were burning. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below saying where in the world you're watching from. These stories deserve to be remembered.